right, welcome back. Thank you so much if you've been following these videos. I really appreciate you continuing to watch and support. Sorry, I'm going to adjust real quick here. I am finally not recording in the middle of the night. So instead, I decided to shoot in broad daylight so I can absolutely blast your eyeballs with how pale my skin is. So apologies for that. One day I will get better lighting, but for now, we're shooting from the truck again. So if you have been following along, in the early part of the week, I make a video more focused on specifically faith-related issues. That's kind of more what my channel is mostly focused on. There's a heavy dose of politics too, but it always has a religious bent to it for the most part. For example, I'm starting to talk about issue by issue how I think a Christian should vote. But today we're going to talk about church, because these past few videos I have made I gave some reasons why I thought, based on scripture passages. Sorry, this is not working with me today. But I gave scripture passages why I thought a Christian must go to church, shared some data-based benefits of going to church regularly, and even talked about some objections. Well, today, obviously my biggest goal is I want to get Christians into good churches. I want to encourage you and help walk you guys through the church search process, because if you're not Catholic or Orthodox, it may be a huge challenge to find a good church, and especially if you're not locked into a denomination that has a pretty well-organized system. So I know it can be a pretty daunting task. My wife and I just recently went through this ourselves, and we actually changed denominations. So we were Baptists at first, and that's kind of how I grew up. And we finished and are now Lutherans. And that's a pretty significant jump. Not as big as becoming Roman Catholic or Orthodox, but it can still be a pretty big change. And so I just kind of wanted to talk a little bit about that journey. So today I'm just going to give you kind of the rough notes, quick notes on my background. I'm really trying to make these videos a little bit more concise. So I've got a hard stop plan for 15 minutes. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of my background, and this, and possibly another video finishing out my thoughts, will then lead into a series where I plan on kind of going into details of the process I used, some what I think is foundational knowledge of the different types of churches and why you might want to gravitate towards some and avoid others. You know, talk about green flags, red flags, all that good stuff. So, I myself, I was born and raised in a Christian home, a devout Christian home, and I am very grateful for it. You know, my mom and dad always made a point to teach us the Bible and the best that they could, to encourage us to read and study, and we were always attending some kind of church. We didn't necessarily have the best attendance, but we were there most weeks. You know, we definitely weren't nominal Christians by any means. I was baptized, and I was always a part of some kind of, Baptist or vaguely evangelical church growing up. We went to a couple different churches as we moved around. But for the most part, I spent most of my time at a Baptist church. And I was baptized. I was about 6 or 7 years old. At the time that I was baptized, I really didn't understand what that meant. And if you're from a tradition that baptizes babies, you're like, okay, well, yeah, that's par for the course. Like, no one really understands what's going on. But for a Baptist or someone from basically a Baptist offshoot, it was an evangelical free church. So wherever that exactly falls in the map of churches, I assume they did it more or less correct, but I didn't really understand what was going on, and we had no record of it. So that's going to come into play a little bit later. So as I got older, we'll come back to that. So baptized as a kid, and I grew up thinking I was a serious Christian. So spent time reading the Bible and not really understanding anything I was reading, but certainly acting like I did. And, attending Wednesday night churches, and went to church camp a couple summers, and was usually there with my parents, even if I almost never paid attention to the sermon. And I cannot, to this day, recall a single sermon that was ever preached growing up. So I don't know if I just had the blinders on. I was not what I was pretending to be. And what this led to is when I hit my college years, I began to drift. And I began to slowly stray from the faith now that I was an adult and just getting my feet underneath me and starting to really have to come to that point of, do I really believe this? Or am I going to go a different path? And I began to question, and really without understanding the process that was going on, I had kind of started to go down the deconstruction path. And, by no means I was surrounded by bad people. I think I should have been better than I was, because I feel like I actually had pretty good company for the most part. At least my roommates, they were pretty much all good Christian guys. They were usually inviting me to the churches that they were attending. I usually went to some kind of campus ministry because they kind of had like a Wednesday night kind of thing. Usually it was on Thursdays, though, if I remember correctly. I know at one point it was Campus Crusade, which had turned to just Crew, I guess. And I want to say it was Christian Challenge is what I regularly attended the most. But even then, I wasn't in a church the whole 4 years I was at college. So that began to have an effect. And I did also, I was in the Army ROTC when I was in college. And yes, it's can be kind of silly, but it wasn't the same thing as the JROTC, which is when you're in high school. So you're just kind of playing Army. I mean, you are still playing Army when you're in ROTC, but at least at that point, it's an actual U.S. Army program. And they're having you go through classes, you do some field exercises and all this stuff. And you have actual soldiers teaching you and training you to eventually, and that's how you lead into becoming an officer, going into the military as a lieutenant, which is what I ended up doing. I was a commissioned officer for 4 years. And during that time, there was one gentleman there at that program at the college I was at, and he was a Christian and held like a small kind of Christian soldier ministry kind of thing. And I came to him with some of my questions, and it was less genuine questions over this whole period and more me slowly giving myself excuses to stray further and further from the path, from the faith. And I began to not think so much when I sinned and started to really get involved in things that I shouldn't. I wasn't doing like hardcore drugs, but I really wasn't much of a partier. But I really struggled for a long time with pornography. And I was tired of feeling guilty about that. So this is kind of the way that I started to kind of drift. And I also struggled to really accept the supernatural aspects of the faith. I even was thinking like, okay, well, yeah, Christianity is kind of a general good for society. It kind of helps keep stability. But a lot of people believe a lot of different things, and a lot of Christians disagree on a lot of different things. So who really knows? So I was taking it very unseriously and was not involved in a church. And this carried on into my Army years. So as I went into my actual training and became an officer and went to Fort Benning and then my unit at Fort Bragg, and I didn't even have the few accountability measures that I did have before. So I really had no friends that were serious Christians. I had a couple people that I knew that, they were kind of like, I guess I'm Christian. But no one that was attending church. So I had no pressure other than from the occasional, check-ins with my family back home that I should be a part of a church. And God bless them. My family back home were praying for me through this whole process. But I strayed pretty far. I never quite went full apostate. So even at my furthest, just being awash in sin, living my life exactly how I wanted to, I was becoming theologically and politically liberal during this time, and I was miserable. But I never quite fully, I was like, even at my furthest, I was like, I don't know. I don't know that I could ever really call myself an atheist or even an agnostic. There was something holding on. I couldn't quite fully, even though I thought a lot of Christianity was ridiculous, even when I didn't even know if I believed the Bible was true, or even if Christ was a real person, something in me, I couldn't ever quite. It was a question of, why are we here? Why is anything here? That was the one thing that always kept me from being like, no, I don't want anything to do with any of this. I could never quite understand why anything exists to begin with if there wasn't some will, some being that pushed the button to begin everything. So that question kept me hanging on just barely. Eventually I left the Army, came back home, and all the people that were praying for me were suddenly around me again. And one of those people that I didn't realize was an old friend from high school. And when he heard I was back in town, he reached out to me and invited me to his church that he had been attending. It wasn't the church we went to growing up, but it was now his own church that he had gone to, that he had decided to attend of his own volition. And at first I was hesitant. I kind of started going to his small group for a little bit. And it was a very slow progression into it. But eventually began dating the woman that is today my wife. And she was an atheist at the time. And I was not taking my faith seriously at all. But God kind of used her in interesting ways to bring not just myself, but both of us back to the faith. Or into the faith for the first time. So she did in time become a Christian. And as we were going through our relationship, we realized we really do need to be going to a church. We can't just be putting this off. So finally, wholeheartedly accepted my friend's invitation, and we got back to church and began attending regularly. And it was a wonderful church. We actually, one of the pastors there counseled us and ended up being the one to marry us and even baptized the both of us. So here that is again. Because there was no record, and because I couldn't definitively know, because I knew nothing about the denomination that performed my baptism. I don't know if they did it properly. There was so much doubt that I was like, listen, even if I've been baptized before, let's go ahead and just do it. That way we know we've done it right. We'll have record of it. We've done it as adults, so we know we mean it. All that. And I was kind of very not sure exactly where I fell on a lot of theological questions, because as I started going back to church, I went back. So I got baptized, and I really started getting into reading my Bible again and studying like I had never studied before. So I don't know if I grew up a Christian and just was immature and only got to a point of maturity that I could really dig deep, or if I was never a Christian and only recently became a Christian for the first time just a couple years ago as of this recording. But I discovered someone on the internet, a channel by the name of Redeemed Zoomer. And if you don't know who that is, he is a guy that got started on YouTube, a young guy, by making funny, little Microsoft Paint videos explaining Christianity. And he himself is a Presbyterian, and I was like, okay, I don't know what that is. I know they're not Catholic, but I know I'm not Presbyterian, but beyond that, I don't know what that is. But he began something that I'm going to talk about in the next video. And that is my dive into church history, into really questioning key doctrines in theology, and, asking all the questions that, not in the way I was asking in college, but now that I was back in a church, asking those questions that eventually kickstarted my search for a new church, because there were certain things as I was reading the Bible and I was looking at the church I was in, didn't quite add up. And we'll talk about that next time. I have hit my time limit, so I need to wrap this one up. But I know it was basically just a 15-minute yap session of me kind of giving my backstory, giving you a little bit of the lore. But thank you very much for watching. I look forward to sharing more with you guys, and I look forward even more to really getting started to help, hopefully, someone else watching this begin a search of their own and get into a church, into a good church, because that is something that we definitely all need. But God bless you guys. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned.